Okay. I'm Andy Himmel with the Restaurant CPAs. I'm thrilled to be back here with Adam Berebitsky, former partner in charge of BDO's National Restaurant Practice, and before that, the director of the entire restaurant practice at SS&G, where I was lucky enough to be a client for many years. Adam, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here, Andy. Thanks for having me.
So today, I'd like to focus on what every restaurant owner should expect from their accountant. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I was a client of SS&G for many, many years. And at one point, you had grown that practice to the largest restaurant accounting firm, I think, in the country prior to merging with BDO. So I think I was a little spoiled. I never really had to worry about much. But in your view, what's the single most important role an accountant should play for a restaurant owner or a restaurant, decision maker?
Well, I think if you have a true restaurant accountant, they really understand the industry. They're just not doing one or two restaurants. They're doing, you know, from 20 to 100 restaurants. So they really understand the restaurant and especially understand the segment that your restaurant is in. So I think that's very important for your accountant to be that uh, up on all the industry data and understanding, where you're at, where you need to be, best practices, and so forth. And I think generalists don't have that.
I remember as a client of yours for a long time, um, I would call with questions that I think many people wouldn't even assume that somebody would reach out to an accountant to ask them, um, almost as just an outlet to someone who had contacts throughout the industry and could advise me on a whole host of topics, certainly not just taxes. In fact, I'm not sure I ever even called about taxes. That became a back burner item for me. I never even thought about compliance and taxes.
Especially if an accountant or accounting firm has multiple restaurant clients, and you call with the question, you can use benchmarking of these other restaurant clients you have and to help you out. Which if you're not doing a lot of restaurants, you just can't do that. You're just pulling things out of thin air.
I remember at one point I had a pretty serious HR related issue that I reached out to you about. And again, I don't think most would reach out to their accountant for an HR related issue. I did before I reached out to our labor attorney. And when I spoke with you, I remember you said, you know what, I'm going to connect you with the HR director at Brio and Bravo because I think they've dealt with something similar. Maybe ask them what the next step should be. And I just remember thinking that saved me the amount of time and stress and money was, beyond valuable.
Yeah, that's a great thing about this industry. Everyone's willing to share, and if people throughout the industry, whether it's other restaurants or other, attorneys or anyone within the ecosystem of, restaurant industry, you can help, point your clients to where they need to find their answers.
It seems like restaurant accountants have made the industry seem a lot smaller than it is. I certainly felt that way for a long time. Um, how often should a restaurant owner expect a proactive accountant to reach out for strategic check-ins?
Well, I think first of all, as a restaurant accountant, you want to get period by period financial statements from the restaurant. I mean, that's very important. Things can happen so quickly in this industry. So as long as I have that information as a restaurant accountant, I can help review, benchmark, and look at changes that are happening, and maybe provide some help and proactive information. Being like that advisor, that they don't have outside advisor, that maybe they don't have a board of directors, and they can be that outside advisors, directing them best practices and what they should be doing. And then I think on the tax side, and you should meet at least on a quarterly basis to provide, not only compliance work, because you're going to need some compliance work on a quarterly basis, but proactive, tax planning to look at what's going on, if there's anything new coming out in the tax laws or even the current laws, are we maximizing those, benefits that are available to the industry?
So, did you and your team reach out, or I guess I would ask that differently? Was the expectation that your team would reach out to their primary clients in their group to set this up each month? Was this something where the restaurants would reach out to you? How would that process work?
I mean, usually it was us reaching out. I mean, the restaurant owners are very busy, and CFOs and so forth. I mean, dealing with all different types of issues, as as a former restaurant owner,
Sure.
all the issues it was my job, as, a partner in charge of the restaurant practice and of my clients to reach out and say, hey, I haven't seen financials, like to see them, see how things are going, looking at, are you maximizing your bottom line, or, what's happening,
I do
things
remember
happen.
getting those
Yeah.
calls.
Right. I mean, a lot of things happen, whether it's weather related, that may affect your financials, a pandemic may affect your financials, whatever it may be. We have to be able to look at the financials and pivot. I mean, if anything, the pandemic taught us in this industry is how to pivot. But that shouldn't have just happened during that period of time. That should be happening all the time to help ways to pivot, in your restaurant and help to improve and to, like I always use the term, best practices. How do you maximize, all that's available to you to help your bottom line?
I remember along the way, a couple different times you were trying to put a group together of restaurant CFOs and restaurant owners
Hmm.
to push better practices conversations,
Yeah.
and that wasn't something that was billed or anything that we were asking for. It was a way to try to, I think,
Hmm.
elevate everyone's game and help everyone network. And I always thought those were really valuable. In fact, some of
Yeah.
the people that I've
Right.
ever known in the industry were from some of those groups that you set up, just to help your clients.
Everyone was sitting in the same seat and had multi-unit restaurant concepts and were having the same questions, and some had some answers, some didn't, some were doing things better than others. And it's just, as a true, like we talked about, true restaurant accountant has multiple restaurants throughout their portfolio, being able to put everyone together and sharing those ideas in one place, maybe on a monthly basis, that's a great way, and that's a value added that most accountants aren't going to provide.
You started one during COVID, and I distinctly remember there's about 8 or 9 people on this one call, and we had not introduced any type of percent increase for our third party delivery menus.
Yes.
I was very nervous about upsetting our guests, our customers. And I remember on that call, again, this was all, through Zoom. I remember
Right.
going around and asking, is everyone adding 5, 10, 20, 30% on? 100% of that group
Yeah.
was. And I left that meeting, and the first thing we did was we jumped into the POS, and the person in our company that was in charge of doing so, we added a 15% across the board charge. I think I was just scared to do it when we were talking internally. And the second I had the opportunity to talk with those other restaurant owners, it didn't even, I was disappointed I didn't do it earlier. So I do remember that was really helpful. Um, what what type of reports, have you helped restaurants or pushed restaurant clients to review regularly or have built for their own review?
Yeah, I mean, it amazes me that some restaurants don't have reports that show their theoretical cost. How do what your gross profit should be if you don't know what your theoretical cost of all your items are, your recipes are, and then you go and have a retail price on those items, and you're expecting to have a 30% cost of goods sold, but if you look and your theoretical cost is really 35%, then you're way off the mark. So I think it's so important to have a report to identify your menu on a cost basis, to understand what your theoretical costs are and what your expected gross profit, and then have a report that compares the actual to theoretical, and see where you can improve, and why you are not hitting those theoreticals, what's happening, maybe waste, there's things, theft, waste, who knows what comes out of that, or maybe your chef is just making too big of a portion when they shouldn't be doing that big of a portion. So there's a lot of things that simple report, looking at theoretical versus actual, can bring out and help you improve. And if you're doing $10 million in revenue and you can save 1%, that's true dollars. So I think that's just a basic report I want to see my restaurant clients have.
So that would be more or less the low hanging fruit.
Yeah,
If,
it's a low
if
hanging
you
fruit.
took on a new client
Yeah.
and none of the information was inputted into some type of database or some type of program, starting with their
Right.
recipes. I assume that's the kind of the foundation, right? It's recipes. Then as you're checking in produce and meats and everything else, it automatically updates that information along the way. So that way you can actually extract out what my cost should be based on the menu price. So would you recommend that as the first item to tackle if they had really never spent time getting organized?
Yeah, I definitely think. I mean, if you have a larger restaurant group and they have the technology, the back of their off, back of the house system that can do that, that's just getting your people to do it, right? But if you're a smaller restaurant company that is still using, Excel, still using QuickBooks, and you may not have that, no, you have to do it in the simplest form. Maybe you don't end up doing every item, or maybe you just do 20 items of your biggest sellers, or do anything. Just do something, because that's just going to help you identify where there could be problems. And we talk about things, where menu engineering I've talked about before, where you're trying to see where your stars are, where your problem childs are, where they are. But if you don't start with knowing sort of what your profit margin should be, and then looking at your mix of your sales mix, you're never going to be able to improve. You're never going to get rid of those bad items that you're never going to make a profit on. So I think it's
That's when you
important to
pray for
start.
great cost at the end of the period without any
Yeah,
reason to expect it to happen. So
absolutely.
I've been there.
Yeah, and with the
What are some
changing,
other?
sorry to talk
No,
over you
sure.
there. With you know commodities changing regularly these days, and not knowing, especially in this day and age with tariffs coming and things, you need to have that in place, because things are moving a lot quicker than they used to. We used to, there are times when costs didn't change much over the whole year, but now they're changing on a monthly basis and so forth. So you need to be ready to make adjustments and to change.
I do remember the prices jumping pretty certainly in the center of the plate side of the business pretty aggressively over the last few years. Almost shocking when I get my weekly sales report. Are there any other metrics or benchmarks that a specialized accountant would identify or push their clients where maybe a generalist doesn't even know that they exist or shouldn't even be thinking about it?
I mean, once again, I think, looking at things that, like, the prime cost, which we started at, that's the basic prime cost goods sold, and labor cost. But I think looking at things such as, sales volume per square footage, looking at sales per labor cost, both the front of the house and the back of the house, understanding, are you getting efficiencies with your labor? I mean, are you too overstaffed? You understaffed? This information, which just putting that in the system, is, I don't want to say easy, but if you manage it correctly, you can get good data to help improve your business and improve those efficiencies. And then,
Real quick, just for those who maybe don't have that already in place, this was a tool that I loved using. So back of house sales per labor hour, that takes into consideration your food sales and
mhm,
the hours it takes to produce that food.
correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And then
Yeah.
the benefit of that, which I always found interesting, we operated in a couple different markets and the cost of labor was very, very different from market to market. I wanted to always know, is my kitchen being efficient? Not are they spending the least amount of money or are they spending the most amount of money? Because I felt that was to an extent arbitrary. I wanted to know if they were actually being efficient.
Yeah,
Is that something that you
absolutely.
would say is very, I can't think a generalist accountant would even know,
No.
to look at it that way.
I always say that, if you can get your labor costs to a place where essentially it's fixed costs and you're getting these efficiencies and you're getting these, sales per labor numbers in the right place, that's where you can make real, money, right? Because whatever control you have on the cost of goods sold, commodities change, you can't control that so much, but you can control your labor a lot more. But if you don't really understand, your labor, then you're going to throw, dollars at the problem. You're going to throw more labor at the problem, or thinking taking less labor, letting people go or not hiring people. That may not be the answer. If you have this data, you'll see, is it working correctly? What's the right number? Because once you get that, the next sale through the door is going to really drop to the bottom line at just, your cost of goods sold, and your labor is going to be basically, as I said, fixed at that time. So that's really important to really focus on that.
Assuming all of that is in place, and um, there's a concept that that guests in whatever markets you're operating in really enjoy. What practical support should a restaurant owner expect from a true restaurant accountant when they're looking to grow their business, expand, maybe throughout the market they're already in or beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you want to set out and put together a pro forma, right? When you're looking at, certain locations, you want to, get some data, work with the restaurant owner and look at some data, maybe possibly of some of the other restaurants in the area, what volumes they're doing, and then put together a pro forma and say, hey, I'm going to have to pay X amount per square footage. If I pro forma the sales I can do in that location based on the seats, but my occupancy cost ends up being 10 to 15%, then you can't do that deal. I mean, it's just not going to work. So to help along with the pro forma, for that next location, number one, then how do we fund that? Are we going to fund it through our cash flow from the other restaurants, or are we going to go out and get some, whether it's bank money or private equity money? How does that look, and what's that going to mean as far as our bottom line? If we're going to
Right. How
put
does that
on
align
some,
with the existing
right,
partners, the
right,
existing
right.
structure?
And debt's not always bad, right? And you got to understand that, but you got to put that into these pro formas and understand what that cost is going to be and how that affects you, and how you can maximize using that debt. So there is a lot of things that, as an accountant, that you can help with. I mean, making those introductions, to whether it's the people that are financing restaurants, which we know is not everybody, right? So just knowing the players in the industry, who is willing to help out, a growing restaurant company.
A warm
You know,
introduction certainly
yeah,
doesn't hurt
yeah,
when it comes to talking with people that have invested in that space, or banks that have loaned money in that space. It definitely
yeah.
helps.
Yeah, I definitely, we've seen, certain banks say no right away, right? But then there's ones, we know just here in our region, who you wouldn't expect to do restaurants, but they've done so many, and they found that, hey, you know, they're good people, and they make money, and they're, good cash flow. So, yeah, you got to find and make those introductions to the restaurants.
Was it helpful? So if I came to you and said, "Hey, I'm looking at this market and this is what my pro forma looks like." So I did the work, right? Or as much as I think I can.
Hmm.
I'm providing you the pro forma. Is it fair to say that because, let's say, SS&G or other firms that have really been um, pretty well represented in the restaurant space, they would have other clients already operating in those spaces or in those markets and be able to validate some of the information, let's say, that one of your clients was bringing to you, which I was always someone that I always found reasons to do deals. Unfortunately, I rarely could talk myself out of a deal, but I assume having actual clients in those markets, it gives some additional weight to your feedback.
Well, I think, if you're really a restaurant accounting firm, you're going to the conferences, you're going to the restaurant finance development conference, you're going, you're subscribing to publications, so how to help your clients, meet the right people in the right areas of the country, or even where you currently are. I mean, that's really important. Like I said before, it's very tight industry, and everyone who's really involved in the industry knows each other. And that's so important. I feel in having that connection, and that helped me along the way and to grow my practice is because I went to these conferences, met the attorneys, met the banks and finance people. And when it came time to help my clients, I knew who to reach out to because
Right. So if I came to you and said, "Hey, look at this pro forma. I'm gonna do amazing in this market," you might have said, "Hey, you need to go talk to this person. He's got 12 restaurants, or she has 12 restaurants in this market. Let's see if they agree with you on what some of your assumptions are," which is
right. And it may be even,
valuable.
yeah, and maybe I know the real estate guy who
Oh,
has,
right.
and he'll tell you, right, or she'll tell you that, yeah, that's a good deal, or no, that's not a good deal. I think just knowing the people throughout the country who are on a regular basis dealing in that area.
So I really have one more question to wrap up our time today. If an owner feels that they're the ones always chasing the answers,
Hmm.
what would you recommend for their next steps?
Well, we've talked about it from the start here. I mean, making sure that you have an accounting firm that really knows this industry. I always say you can't fake it. If you don't know people in the industry, like a John Hamburger, I use the name a lot. If you don't know on the attorney side, like a
The
Dennis,
owner of Franchise
right,
Times
franchise times.
and the Restaurant Finance Development Conference.
Correct. I mean, and attorneys like a Dennis Monroe up in Minneapolis, who's well known in the industry, and their firm specialize. And there's other law firms. I'm just naming some, but I think it's so important, to have this group of people in your network and to help your clients along. As an accountant, we know only so much. We better know the financial side. We better know the tax side of it. But there's so much more that you can help and be proactive with your clients by having that network of people. And that's what I did. And people thank me for it, a lot, because like you mentioned connecting you to certain people. And it wasn't always, I wasn't always the person giving them the best value added, maybe information. It was the person I introduced them to, which was just as good. And I think, that helps. And just if you're involved in the industry as much as I said, then you will be able to be proactive because you're seeing this all the time, and it's not new. A restaurant generalist, I'm not a restaurant generalist, an accounting generalist would have no idea. They'd have to look it up. They'd have to go on AI. They'd have to do something, to find answers. If you're truly dealing with the industry, you understand all the terminology, and you understand the people in this industry.
Well, I guess we'll leave it there. Adam, thank you so much
Okay.
for joining me today. And just one quick note: if you are ready to level up your restaurant's financial strategy, definitely visit the restaurantcpas.com. There is a lot of noise out there, and there are a lot of accountants and a lot of restaurants, and we certainly can help you find the right match, so you have the same relationship I had with SS&G, you'll have with the right firm for your restaurant company as well. So, Adam, thank you again,
Well,
and I look forward to talking soon.
well, thanks, Andy. It was great talking to you. Thanks.
Thanks.